Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Robin Griffith-Jones, and I teach at King's College London, and I am grandly called the Reverend and Valiant Master of the Temple at the Temple Church just half a mile away. And I am here really only in order to say hello to all of you, to say what a real delight it is that so many people have come here this evening to enjoy and discuss and relish and learn from Tom's new book. And of course, above all, and on behalf of all of us here, to thank Tom himself. I suspect almost all of us have been benefiting from Tom's work for decades now. There is the rather serious N.T. Wright, whom we know well. There is Tom Wright and the New Testament for everyone. And now, a third genre, this rollicking read. I mean, it's a ripping yarn. I hope some of you have already read the book. It's an absolute page-turner. Dan Brown, eat your heart out. It really is, it's completely gripping from beginning to end. It introduces a new side to Paul's own writing and scholarship, and as it were, a new side for all of us who've enjoyed Tom's writing as we followed it through the years. So, Tom, in introducing this evening, what I think all I need to say is, from all of us who have or are enjoying or are going to enjoy the book, many thanks. And for all of us here this evening, thank you for what is clearly going to be an absolutely fascinating session. We're extremely grateful to you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robin, and thank you also for your review in one of the Sunday papers a couple of months ago now. I hadn't heard about this review, but I met somebody through a mutual friend who said, "Oh, I just saw a review of your new book." And I said, "Oh, really? Was it a good review?" He said, "Well, I don't think the person actually liked Paul that much, but he liked your book." So I said, that's fine by me. Whether that is a fair representation of the review or of Robin, I leave others to judge. And I'm very grateful to those who organized this amazing building for getting us this room tonight. I'm especially grateful to SPCK, who've done a lot of work behind the scenes to set it up. I'm grateful to Robin. I'm grateful to Martin Bashir, who's going to be helping with asking some questions later on. I'm especially grateful to those of you who intended to come in early March and were prevented, like Paul himself was prevented from some of his travel plans. I was booked on a train from Aberdeen, where I was doing some lectures, to London, a straight through one, and I got as far as Dundee, and the snow came down. I couldn't even get to Edinburgh, and we were texting and emailing and going to and fro, and eventually we just had to pull the whole event. And so we decided that instead of being disrupted by snowflakes, we'd be disrupted by sunshine and heat instead. So I came down on the train yesterday, and you know how it is with us northerners. The best building in London is King's Cross Station, where you get on this train to go back up north, but which I shall be doing tomorrow. So just a few things to put some markers down, because it won't surprise you to know that just as Paul on occasion could actually preach people to death, you know, people fell out of windows and so on, it's been on and on and on. So given world enough and time, I'd be quite happy to talk about Paul to you until the bells have stopped ringing, whenever that is. By the way, thanks also to Westminster Abbey for arranging this splendid fusillade of I'm sure that was quite deliberate. Since I used to work there, they probably got it in for me. So I want to ask a few basic questions, and I've been doing some interviews with various podcasts and other things over the last few days, and today particularly, and these are the questions that people keep coming up with. The first one is why a biography of Paul? I mean, anyone who's been to church, anyone who's started to read the Bible, to read the New Testament, knows a bit about Paul, or thinks they do, and has bumped their nose against him a bit. But I really want to say, and in this book I try to say, Paul is one of the most important public intellectuals of all time. One of the tragedies of the way we do things in the Western world today is that if somebody wants to study Paul, they'll probably be sent to a department of religion. Wrong place. Paul belongs in the world of politics, of culture, of economics, of community life, as well as what we call religion and theology and philosophy. And we diminish Paul if we think of him simply as a quote-unquote religious figure. He is out there articulating a new vision of all all reality. And he's not only articulating it verbally and in writing, he's articulating it through creating and forming and chivying and managing and wrestling with real communities who are experimenting with this remarkable new way of being human. And as a result, there are probably far more people today who wrestle with Paul than there are with the two great public intellectuals, as it were, either side of him, Cicero and Seneca, and others like him. These are great people, and Plutarch and Epictetus, and those great figures. But Paul, nevertheless, stands out. And he stands at one of the great transition points, the great sort of turning point in world history, and he stands there holding together the Jewish world, the Greek world with all its philosophy, the Roman world with all its politics and its new roads and so on, and he holds them in a new synthesis in a way that nobody had done before. Because though there were some books like the Wisdom of Solomon that were doing a bit of that, Paul, by being grasped by the gospel of Jesus, Israel's Messiah, crucified and risen, now the Lord of the world, Paul has a new vantage point from which he holds all these things together, so that he's absolutely insistent that what has happened and what he's doing is the fulfillment of Israel's purpose. This is where it was all going, even though we never saw it, rather like the two on the road to Emmaus. Oh, we had hoped that he would redeem Israel, but now did not our hearts burn within us as he expounded the scriptures? This is how it had to be. Paul has that in spades. So it's fulfilling Israel's aspirations, albeit in a shocking new way. And that gives Paul, as it were, the theological and scriptural energy which carries him into all the tasks that he does and to face all the sufferings that he does. But then Paul realizes that if Israel's God is the Lord of the world, and if Israel's God has revealed once for all the great truths about the way the world really is, this means we must, in his words, take every thought captive to obey the Messiah. So Paul can quite cheerfully outflank the Stoics, outflank the Epicureans, outflank the Academy, the Platonists. And sometimes he sounds a bit like a Stoic, sometimes he sounds a bit like a Platonist, and then the larger edifice reasserts itself, and we see that in his exposition of Jesus as the meaning of the whole creation, we find all these strands of truth, of philosophy, of human exploration and wisdom held together, rushing together. And then if it's Israel's traditions and the thought of the Greek world, it's also the Roman world with its extraordinary empire, which was just doing its thing in spades in the middle of the first century. And Paul comes along and talks about the good news that Jesus is Kyrios, Lord, and sometimes even that Jesus is Soter, Savior, another thing that some of the Caesars like to say about themselves. And Paul envisages, I was going to say, a new kind of empire. The word empire is very contested at the moment, and part of the point of what Paul is doing, just as you find in Jesus' teaching in, say, Mark chapter 10, is that empire has been stood on its head. Power itself has been stood on its head. There is a new power, a new sort of power let loose in the world. It's the power of suffering love, which is one of the reasons why Paul himself realizes that if he is to be the vessel and the instrument of that love, he himself will be called to suffer in all sorts of ways. So why a biography of Paul? Because somebody who could think all this and try to do all this is far more than just a brain box on legs or even a praying heart on legs. He's all of that, but he's a whole rounded personality, intersecting into engaging with whole rounded communities and trying to do something new. So Paul is vital as the early interpreter of Jesus. Jesus, the one who announced and more particularly inaugurated God's kingdom. Something new has happened. A victory has been won, as a result of which the world is a different place. It's hard for us to hear that because so much in the public world of today says, no, nothing actually changed. It just all went on. You just had some new religious ideas, and there were plenty of other new religious ideas. And Paul would have said, absolutely not. When Jesus rose again from the dead, something changed in the way the world is, which opens a door. The great rusty door of history has swung open, and a voice says, now come into God's new world and see what it looks like. So when Paul is holding together Jewish Jesus believers and Gentile Jesus believers and insisting that they belong at the table together, this isn't just about having slightly better table manners. The fact that now Jew and Greek and slave and free and male and female belong at the same table is the sign, as far as he's concerned, that the powers that have ruled the world and have kept the world in its different compartments have been defeated. And if you don't believe that, he says to Peter at Antioch, you're denying the truth of the gospel. So why a biography of Paul? That's for starters. Why a biography at all? Well, without the biography, we meet the letters in a vacuum. One of the things that encouraged me as I was stimulated by my publisher into thinking that maybe I should try my hand at this, as Robin said, a new genre for me, the biographical genre, was Robert Harris's trilogy on Cicero. I don't know if you've seen the play which is on in the West End at the moment, Imperium. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see it. I'd really like to. Those 3 books, I now recommend them to my undergraduates because they open up a sense of this is what it was actually like to be trying frantically to prepare a speech, realizing you weren't going to have enough time, and scribbling something else down. Cicero's wife telling him off because he's being a wimp or whatever, and then Cicero getting his bodyguards and heading off for the forum, and there's so-and-so's men over there, and then he has to make the speech, so that by the time you get to the speech, you are living it with him. Instead of, when I studied Cicero at school, here was Cicero's speech on this or that, so we learned a little bit of the background. But with those books, I felt I was actually living it with him. And I wanted to try to write a book in which by the time we get Paul writing Galatians, we are living it with him so that we know ahead of time, of course, he's got to say this or that. And by the time he's in his huge depression, which I'll come back to in a moment, we understand why that would be and how maybe he's going to get. So only a biography, I think, can really show the continuities of person and the continuities and the slippages of bits of thought and scriptural exposition and so on. And particularly the personal passion and then the dark sides into which it all fits. So what's new? What's new in this book? I mean, I've written other books about Paul, as some of you will know, as Robin kindly alluded to. When I was writing this book, there were several things which I found I had to say something about that I'd never really said much about before. And the first one is the quiet decade. After the initial flurry, the Damascus event, the trip to Arabia, back to Damascus, down to Jerusalem, this man is too hot to handle, send him back to Tarsus, that's where he came from, we'll see what happens. Then we know nothing for 10 years. However, the fact that we know quite a lot after those 10 years, after Barnabas fetches him to Antioch and things go from there, what we know about him from Antioch onwards tells us quite a lot about those 10 years, not least where Romans 9:1-5 comes from. As some of you will know, that's where he says, I have unceasing sorrow and anguish in my heart because I'm moved to tears constantly because of my kinsfolk, my brothers and sisters according to the flesh. This is not a theoretical group called the Jews. I think this is mum and dad. I think this is brother and sister. I think this is even possibly a one-time fiancé. Who knows? That's speculation. But there is a sense that when he's talking about these people who he longs to see come to accept Jesus as Israel's Messiah, these are real people. He knows their faces. He's got their voices in his head. He remembers their tears, and it's moved him to tears. And then at the other end of his life, I'd never written very much about whether Paul went to Spain or not. I used to think that's a bridge too far. The more I looked at it, and particularly at the letter of Clement, who was bishop in Rome towards the end of the first century, he says Paul got to the limits of East and West. Well, he was there pretty soon afterwards. I think it's more likely that Clement got it right than that I am getting it right by being a bit skeptical about that. So it's possible that Paul did get through Spain. One of the other things, quite different sort of thing, which I hadn't really put together before, was Paul's prayer life. We see Paul's prayer life bubbling up at certain points in the letters. And when he says to people, pray constantly, it would be very odd if he was giving that advice to everybody, but he wasn't actually doing it himself. And so when I then started to explore what it looked like for Paul to be a man of prayer, starting to explore the Jewish prayer traditions and to see the way in which his invocation of Jesus and the Spirit fits somehow within those Jewish narratives and prayers, then I started to see all sorts of things in three dimensions. But in particular, and I think we may be talking about this later on when Martin is asking me some questions, I found myself seeing the famous doctrine of justification by faith itself within that larger context of who Paul was as a whole, so that you don't actually lose anything that the 16th century was so keen on about we are justified by faith, not works, but you see it in many dimensions, and we'll maybe say more about those dimensions later on. But one of the things which I found most compelling at the middle of all of this was the dark period to which Paul alludes at the start of 2 Corinthians. And I describe in the book the happy early days in Ephesus where he's going around and healings are happening and people are bringing handkerchiefs to touch him so that then sick people will be healed. Imagine what that does. I mean, how did Paul sustain and not having an overinflated ego? Well, maybe he didn't, who knows? But in the middle of that, he made a painful visit to Corinth, and suddenly it all went wrong. And stuff he thought he could do, he couldn't do anymore. And they were rude to him, and they told him, go away, and if you want to come back, we'd like to have fresh letters of recommendation. Well, any pastors among you will know what that would be like from the people with whom you've worked and who you've loved and prayed for and so on. But I think then things are going on in Ephesus as well. Bad things which go horribly wrong after the great riot in the theatre. I think it's after. That's slightly tricky to be quite sure. But as I try to describe it now, I find myself looking at what Paul says there, where he says, I was so crushed that I despaired of life itself. Now, I as a pastor know that if somebody came into the room and said that to me, I would be thinking, this is above my pay grade. I need to call in a professional counselor to help with this, because that is serious depression. And you don't get out of that just by saying, well, go home and say your prayers and don't drink so much coffee or whatever it is. No, this is a very serious thing. And I think that we see something going on when he says this was to make me rely on the God who raises the dead. If you know anything about depression, you can't come through it simply by saying, you know perfectly well you ought to rely on the God who raises the dead. That's not how it happens. I think what happens, what we see then when we put the whole picture together, is that, if I can just read you a few lines here, I think that like a plant in harsh winter, Paul in prison was forced to put his roots down even deeper than he had yet gone into the biblical tradition, and deeper again still within that tradition into the meaning of Jesus and his death. And the roots slowly found moisture, and from the depth of that dark soil, way below previous consciousness, he drew hope and new possibilities. And the fruit of that labor remains to this day near the heart of Christian belief, because, as I've suggested in the book, if he is writing Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians and Philemon from that prison in Ephesus, then what we see in each of those letters, except for Philemon, which is the shorter one of course, is a sense of Jewish prayer reshaped around Jesus, turned into poetry. I think actually the poetry of Ephesians 1, Philippians 2, Colossians 1, I think that poetry precedes the theology. I don't think somebody had hammered out the theology and then Paul said, let's write a poem about it. I think he comes out of the darkness, and like some other people, one could think of R.S. Thomas or Gerard Manley Hopkins, emerging from the darkness with things that can only be said poetically, which then the church realizes this is the heart of what we then call theology. What's difficult for us about this? Well, we still tend to reach for this category, religion. The word religion didn't mean in Paul's day what it means in our day, and what Paul is doing doesn't fit religion in the ancient world or religion in the modern world. As I said before, it's really quite different. It's a much bigger community experiment based in worship of the God made known in Jesus, flowing out into every aspect of life. And watch out for this category religion, because our world tries to put us and Paul and Jesus into that. For Paul, what matters is he insists to his dying day that he is utterly loyal to the one God of Israel. That's a contested statement in the first century. Who is a loyal Israelite is a big question in the first century. There are many groups claiming it, and Paul is right there in the middle among them. But today it's controversial as well. It's one of the reasons I was so thrilled when Rabbi Lord Sachs very generously put a commendation on the back of this book. I sent it to him because I said to him, I really don't want any Jewish interlocutor to pick up this book and say, well, this person doesn't understand Judaism. So I thought, let's send it to the chief rabbi and see what he thinks. And bless him, he was kind enough to write a commendation. So, summing it all up, what was Paul trying to do? What was his aim? It would be easy to say, and 50 years ago I would have said, Paul was telling people about Jesus so that when they died they would go to heaven. And I really want to say, that's the wrong place to start. Now, as some of you know, if you read my book Surprised by Hope and other bits and pieces, the New Testament doesn't say that the name of the game is how to get to heaven when you die. If you go to the 1st century AD looking for somebody who talks about that, the primary person I would go to is Plutarch, who is a 1st century Middle Platonist, who has a whole treatise on how our souls are exiled from their true home in heaven, and we hope one day that they'll get back there. That's not what Paul says. Paul is looking forward to the day when God will renew heaven and earth and will raise his people from the dead to a new bodily life within that new integrated reality. Now, how this plays out is full of all sorts of other questions. But I want then to say, so what was Paul doing? Well, he was founding and maintaining communities. And I have a riff which I've been developing out of this book and so on. What sort of communities? Well, they're worship-based, educational, egalitarian, philanthropic, fictive kinship groups. I'll say it again. They're worship-based, educational, egalitarian, philanthropic, fictive kinship groups. Our shorthand for that is churches. But if we say churches, then that will conjure up various images in our minds from which at least one or two of those words will probably be missing. Worship-based because they exist in order to invoke Jesus as Lord, to celebrate his presence and his healing power and his reconciling work in them and through them into the world, because they're also educational. What were people teaching in Paul's churches? One of the things I think they were teaching was how to read. A lot of people were functionally illiterate in the ancient world, but Paul wanted them to be able to search the scriptures for themselves. That's part of Christian maturity. So the church was in the vanguard of teaching people to read and to read scripture particularly. And they were egalitarian, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We struggle still to implement that. For Paul, that was an extraordinary, unheard of experiment, a very dangerous one. People would look on and see all these people, very different people, all going into a house on a Sunday morning. Who are they? What are they doing? And they talk about family and so on. And they are philanthropic. Paul says, while we have time, do good to all people, and especially to those of the household of faith. The churches were doing what the Jewish communities had done, that is to say, looking after people in their own community who needed help, who needed money, who needed healing, medicine, and whatever. But now they were doing it as far as they could for everyone. This is one of the main reasons why Christianity spread. Nobody had ever tried this experiment. Let's have egalitarian, philanthropic communities who, even if they're not doing all the stuff on the street, worshipping the idols, going on the processions, etc., even if they're not doing any of that, so people think this is bad news, they'll get us into trouble, maybe there'll be an earthquake or a lightning strike or something, we'll know who to blame. No, these are people who people regard as good neighbors. Paul says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. The people on your street who are having a party, you go and be the life and soul of that party. The people who are having a funeral, you go and genuinely share their sorrow. These are people who other people will enjoy having them around. And there'll be a reason for that, because they are reflecting the generous love of Jesus into that community. And they are living as, in the anthropologist term, fictive kinship groups. That is to say, living as family, even though it's blindingly obvious that they're not. And the ancient world, family means the people who are down the street from you who will help you out. One of the nicest moments I had when I was Bishop of Durham was one night I was doing a confirmation in a very much below the tracks parish in Gateshead, and the vicar asked one of the confirmation candidates, a woman in her 30s, he said, what's it like since you've been coming to this church? And she blurted it out. She said, it's like having a great big second family. And then she turned to me and said, was I supposed to say that? And I said, yes, that means this is a real church. She lived in a community where family meant precisely the people round the corner who would look out for you when bad things were happening, or would celebrate with you when good. And she had found the church to be that sort of community. Thank God that it never gets into the press, of course, but there are many, many communities like that who are doing precisely what Paul said they should. As a result, Paul is bringing into being, through his announcement of the gospel, through his prayer, his pastoral work, and particularly his letters, he's bringing into being a new cultural and social reality, breaking with existing patterns and forms, and yet demonstrating an attractive and compelling new way of being human. It is, as some people have described it, Judaism for the masses. Nietzsche sneered at Christianity and said that Christianity was Platonism for the masses. Well, maybe some 19th century Christianity was, that's what he was mocking. But really, it is this Jewish vision of one God, one people, and it's for everybody. And to that end, what Paul was doing through his preaching, teaching, pastoral work was aiming at renewed human lives. He says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may figure out and put into practice what God's will is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Renewed humans, he says in Colossians 3, renewed in knowledge according to the image of the Creator. Paul has this vision of humans made in God's image, and humans now renewed in God's image, and humans therefore renewed in thought. Paul says when it comes to evil, just stay as ignorant little babies, but when it comes to thinking, be grown-ups. The gospel for Paul is all about people discovering what it means to be genuine humans, not least by learning how to think. For Paul, you see, somebody asked me this in a radio interview earlier today. Why doesn't Paul refer more to Jesus' teaching? That's an interesting question, but one of the answers, not the only answer, but one of the answers is, if in order to answer a question, what you have to do is to look up something on a shelf, oh yes, that's it, and then put the book back, you don't grow. That may see you around the next corner, but what Paul does instead is not just to teach them what to think, but to teach them how to think. That's why he says in Philippians 2, you've got to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. That doesn't mean do good works to impress God. It means you've got to figure out what this means. Here are the tools, now you go to the job. And actually that's so for Scripture as a whole, but it's certainly part of Paul's ministry, that it's never a look it up and put the book back on the shelf kind of thing. It's all about every generation has to engage with this stuff in an increasing maturity of thought and reflection. Because only if we're doing that will we be the kind of communities and the kind of individuals that God wants us to be. And if it's a renewed human community, a renewed thinking human community, it's a renewed thinking and loving human community. A community which is founded on the basis, as Paul says, that the love of the Messiah drives us on. Or as he says in Galatians, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. And that love then has to reflect out into because that's what does the trick. That's what makes people think, nothing else in my life looks like this. This is where genuine life is to be found. So what was Paul himself like? Towards the end of the book, I wrote a few pages on this, and I just want to quote a few little bits from that. The first thing coming at us through the story is his sheer energy. We feel it pulsing through the letters. We watch as he responds to violence in one city by going straight on to the next one and saying and doing the same things. He's working all hours, his hands hardened with tent making, his back stiff from bending at the workbench, but he's ready every moment for the visitor with a question, for the distraught youngster whose parents have thrown him out, for the local official worried what's going to happen if people discover he's following Jesus, and so on and so on and so on. But the second thing is his blunt, upfront habit of telling it like he sees it. He'll say boo to every goose within earshot and to all the swans as well. There is a reason why Saul of Tarsus is the one getting into trouble, just as there is a reason why the Jerusalem apostles decided to pack him off to Tarsus. He confronts Peter in Antioch and so on. He's the kind of man you want on your side in a debate, even if he may alienate some more sensitive souls. He still does that today. He confronts the magistrates at Philippi. He's itching to speak to the vast crowd at Ephesus. He tries to explain himself to the Jerusalem mob that's been trying to lynch him. He rebukes the high priest. He knows how to turn the factions in the Sanhedrin against one another. He lectures the Roman governor himself about justice, if you please. He tells the ship owner where he should and shouldn't spend the winter, and when it goes horribly wrong, he says, "I told you so." He spots the sailors trying to bolt and tells the centurion to stop them doing it. As a companion, he must have been exhilarating when things were going well and exasperating when they weren't. As an opponent, he could cause some people to contemplate murder as their only recourse. It's very interesting. I've done various odd jobs in my time, and people write doctoral dissertations about how successful companies and not-for-profit organizations begin. And in 99 cases out of 100, there's someone like Paul, hammering away, getting things off the ground, confronting local authorities, raising money, persuading co-workers what needs to be done, never losing the vision, taking the bull by the horns. Someone will go on insisting the whole time, we've got to do this stuff. But there's also something disarming about his vulnerable side, which means that despite his relentlessness, people loved him and wanted to work with him and wept when he left. When he says that his heart is open wide, we believe him. It rings true. His honesty shines out. With Paul, what you see is what you get, even if it isn't always what you wanted. You know where you are. You know he will do anything for you because he would say, God has done everything for us in the Messiah Jesus. And so it goes on. That's what he was like. So what? Where does this leave us? I found as I was working on this book, the letters were coming to life in a new way. I've been studying Paul on and off all my life, but they came up in 3 dimensions again and again as part of a fully rounded history, a warts and all history, a multicultural, swirling, multi-ethnic mix. And for us, now as then, we struggle with the things he struggled with. When I was writing my previous big book on Paul and the Faithfulness of God, I was looking for what are the things that Paul wants to see which tells the world what sort of a community this is. And the 2 things again and again are unity and holiness. Now, any of you in church work, you know as well as I do, unity is easy if you don't care about holiness. Holiness is easy if you don't care about unity. Trust me, I'm a bishop, I know. The trick, the really difficult thing, is to have them both together. That is really, and that's what Paul is working at. That's why the pastoral side of him is wrestling in 1 Corinthians with what it means, all this stuff about food offered to idols. What does it mean to be holy in a pagan city? To be monotheistic in a pagan city? What does it mean to be united when in the church there are some people who think it's fine to eat any meat that's sold in the market because God made it all and he loves us, so that's okay, and other people are still crushed with the burden of their pagan past and don't want to touch that meat in case it reminds them of the way they used to live. Paul the pastor brings unity and holiness together, confronting a confused and dangerous world with the challenge and the comfort of the unstoppable love of the Creator God. That's why I love him. That's why I want to go on studying. And that's what this book's about. Thank you very much.
Have a seat. I'm sure it wasn't lost on you that the bells rang throughout your talk and ceased the moment I came up, which is an indication of Westminster Abbey's view. This is a remarkable book, Professor Wright. It's historical, anthropological, sociological, theological. But in addition to you being a professor, you're also a pastor. You referred to that just now. You were a bishop. And so I want to start by asking you about one of the things that you draw out in the book in relation to suffering. You write this: the visit to Rome ends with the start of Paul's new life, that of a suffering apostle. God's kingdom is indeed breaking in, that new divine rule, but it will mean undergoing suffering. Again, you write, the bodily marks of identification that mattered to Paul were not the signs of circumcision, but the marks of Jesus, in other words, the signs of suffering. How does the apostle commend the Christian faith in the first century, and how does that compare to things we often hear today in the church, where people are promised health and wealth, a triumphalism, a God at your disposal? How does Paul differ?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I personally don't usually attend churches that promise things like that, and that's just my background.
But you'll know that many people do.
I know that many people do, absolutely. And, I mean, we can't get round sayings of Jesus about I came that they might have life and have it more abundantly. You know, that's absolutely comes with. And when Paul talks about love and joy and peace, that's all true. But when Paul talks about those things, he's either writing from prison or he's writing with the wounds still on him from the last time he was beaten up or stoned or whatever. So there's an odd, rich mixture. I think the crucial thing for Paul is that he really believes that he is living on the cusp of the new creation, that the new creation has broken in, but the old creation not only is rumbling on and it's deadly and it's corrupt and it's decaying, but the old creation resents the new creation breaking in and is doing its best to strike back. And I think that's what Paul thinks was going on in his moment of terrible darkness in Ephesus, which he talks about in 2 Corinthians 1. And by the way, I had a letter just last week from a pastor I knew from a previous job who had been reading that book, and I hadn't heard from him for some years, but he said that passage had reduced him to tears because he had just been through a period like that in his pastoral ministry, and he thought, oh my goodness, Paul went through this too. This is my life. And it was hugely encouraging to him. So that I think the main thing is that Paul is telling people that God's new world is breaking in. It has broken in Jesus. It is breaking in through the power of the Spirit. But if you are on the leading edge of that, and if you're committed to following Jesus and living in one of these extraordinary multivalent fictive kinship groups, i.e. churches, then stuff is going to happen. The powers are going to strike back. And sometimes that's apparently rather trivial, and sometimes it's very dark and very nasty. But it often involves suffering of one sort or another. I was reflecting, I didn't know you were going to ask me that question, but I was reflecting a couple of days ago for quite a different reason. I have a prayer list, people I pray for every day, some I pray for every week, etc. And I went right down a long list, and I realized that all these people, old friends, family members, etc., I know things about their lives where there are points of darkness and suffering and pain and grief and anxiety, one after another after another. You know, what we think of as the sort of normal, happy, healthy family actually is very, very rare. Almost all of us have got sorrows and pains and difficulties and angsts here and there. And for Paul, that is multiplied by the fact of being on the leading edge of the new age breaking. And he teaches his congregations this is going to happen.
So he teaches them about suffering. But there's another thing that you draw out in the book, and that is Paul's emphasis on what you call the absolute condemnation of sexual immorality.
Yeah.
Now, again, I was reading a lecture by Professor Larry Hurtado at Edinburgh University, and he writes, Christianity effectively erased the double standard. Men were to practice the same kind of sexual discipline that was expected of women. The moral quality of the Christian life for both men and women was to shine in the culture.
Yeah.
And yet again, you seem to be suggesting, here's the Apostle Paul commending Christianity, and what are the two bulwarks? He says you're going to suffer and there's to be no sexual immorality.
Yeah.
That's hardly a great marketing slogan, is it?
No, and although I think this may be one of the reasons why, as Rodney Stark argues in his book, The Rise of Christianity, why a lot of women found Christianity very attractive, because instead of being abused and exploited, this was a new world in which they were valued and cherished, and in which men behaved themselves, supposedly. Now, of course, the church had failings and then and now. You see it in 1 Corinthians. But it's part of the new creation, the idea, and you see this in Mark 10 in Jesus' teaching, the idea that if God is remaking the world, let's get Genesis 1 and 2 right this time. And that means, you know, the standards of marriage which are there in the Jewish world and which are now an innovation in the pagan world. I mean, I forget who it was, some classical writer, some modern writer about the classics I was reading, who said that basically in the ancient pagan world, for a man, Larry's point, you just had as much sex as you could, and the only thing that was stopping you was kind of jealous husbands or whoever, that you know, otherwise it was open season. And so for the early church to stand out on this is truly remarkable. The great philosopher and doctor at the end of the 2nd century, Galen, doesn't know much about the Christians, but he knows two things about them, on both of which make him think that they're mad. One, they believe in the resurrection of the body, and two, they don't sleep around. Wouldn't it be nice if the church was known for that today? You know, there's, in both cases, this is a valuation of the goodness of creation. It's a celebration of what it means to be made in the image of God, made with bodies that are to be redeemed and therefore are to be valued, instead of being treated as trivial toys.
You were talking earlier about your motivations in writing, and I know I've read before where you've said the problem has often been 19th century questions with 16th century answers, which I guess is a polite way of dismissing the whole of the Reformation's theology, but we'll come to that.
Not dismissing it, but renegotiating it.
Right. But for those outside of the church, perhaps Paul's moment on the road to Damascus is the single event in the apostle's life that people know about. I'm talking about completely unchurched individuals. What happened on the road to Damascus?
If we asked Paul that, he would say, Jesus revealed himself to me, and or I met him, I saw him. For Paul, this wasn't what we would mean by a vision. In other words, Paul is quite clear this isn't like the subjective visions that other people have. He differentiates his seeing of Jesus from any subsequent ones. He says, last of all. So it's a resurrection appearance. It's the risen Lord appearing personally. And in order to make sense of that, I think Paul would say to us in our late modern world, you need to understand that in God's world, heaven and earth are not far apart. They are made to overlap and interlock. That's very counterintuitive for us because our culture is deeply Epicurean with a distant God and a heaven, and we're down here. But in biblical thought, heaven and earth are made for each other, and Jesus stands at the intersection. And so how did that happen? I've argued in the book, and this isn't original to me, other people have said this as well, that Paul was praying on the road to, he's a zealous Jew, off to do God's business, so of course you're praying that you will be in a state of holiness while you're doing this terrible work. And one of the ways that devout Jews prayed was to use Ezekiel chapter 1, the whirling wheels of the throne chariot, and then the chariot itself, and then your eyes go up to the figure on the chariot. And I've argued in the book that maybe Paul was doing that, and that when he got to see who was sitting on the divine throne chariot, it was Jesus himself, which is a moment of total fulfillment and total confusion and devastation. It destroys everything and fulfills everything.
Was that, in the language of theologians, the moment he was converted?
I wouldn't put it like that. If I say someone was converted today, the normal assumption would be this person has been an atheist or an agnostic or whatever and has come to faith, had a spiritual experience. Paul was a deeply spiritual man, deeply prayerful man who worshipped the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob as the creator God, the God of Israel. Paul never stopped worshipping the creator God, the God of Israel, throughout his life. What happened was that he came to realize that this God he'd always worshipped had acted in and as Jesus, and then he quickly came to realize was active in and through his spirit. So we have to be very careful in case we give the impression that Paul leaves something called Judaism and embraces something called Christianity. The isms and the ities are a 19th century invention. That's part of our problem.
But the reality is that the apostle stops enforcing Jewish obedience to the law, something he'd done with violence.
Yep. But he says,
after that experience.
Yeah, this is where we need to subpoena the whole of Galatians chapter 3, because that's where he hammers that one out, where he makes the very strong argument that God made promises to Abraham about how he was going to save the whole human race, in principle, I mean, save people of all sorts, if you like, and that the law, the Mosaic law, was given as a good but temporary dispensation. And that's a complicated bit of theology, but it's necessary to say the law was good, but its purpose is now fulfilled, and Moses is kind of pointing on. In Romans 8 he says what the law couldn't do, God has now done. That's the key.
And you've helpfully taken us on to something that Paul is theologically associated with, perhaps more closely than any other, and that is the doctrine of justification by faith. Towards the end of the book, and I'm quoting you, you pose this question: if the word pistis can mean loyalty as well as faith, then might one express Paul's famous doctrine as justification by loyalty? I have to confess that's a new one on me. Are you suggesting that the individual's justification before God, according to Paul, includes some kind of demonstration of loyalty?
I think part of the problem, this is getting technical, so forgive us, but this word pistis, P-I-S-T-I-S, which we normally translate as faith, as Martin says, means loyalty, trustworthiness, trustfulness, the whole range of things. And I think in Romans itself, we see Paul exploiting those different meanings. When he says up front that this is the gospel about Jesus, the Son of David, the Son of God, raised from the dead, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the nations. That's another Caesar phrase. Caesar wanted obedient loyalty, thank you very much. Jesus is the Lord who wants obedient loyalty. The danger with that is if you're asking the question of justification in terms of what do I have to do in order that God will be pleased with me, then it sounds as though I have to do something, I have to be loyal instead of just believe. And that's where we need to pan right back and say, nope, that's not what we're talking about. That is where the 16th century, and actually it wasn't their fault, got into a muddle because they were responding to the Middle Ages. I've often said Luther and Calvin and the others, who are among my great heroes, were trying desperately to give biblical answers to late medieval questions. That's much better than giving non-biblical answers to late medieval questions. But let's think about what the first century questions were, and they weren't the same questions, and that's where the slippage comes.
But of course, Thomas Cranmer, speaking of this doctrine specifically, writes, "This proposition, that we be justified by faith only, freely and without works, is spoken in order to take away clearly all merit of our works as being insufficient to deserve our justification at God's hand."
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you embrace that as an assertion of what Paul's saying?
No, I embrace that as an assertion of what had to be said urgently in the middle of the 16th century. And bless Cranmer for saying that, because that wasn't where he started, but he went to the stake for that and associated doctrines. But when we pan back and say, that's what needed to be said to ward off the 15th century heresies, what needs to be said by Paul is that God intends to put the whole world right, point one. God has dramatically launched and inaugurated this project by raising the crucified Jesus from the dead, point two, so that the world has in principle been put right. And God now, through grace, through the gospel, puts human beings right so that they can be part of his putting right project for the world.
And being part of that project does not require a demonstration by myself of good works, of effort.
It doesn't require it, but as Luther himself would say, if it doesn't issue in that, something is wrong with the initial faith. I mean, that's quite clear. If you just, I mean, some of Luther's early treatises make this extremely clear, that faith works through love, according to Galatians. And love and faith actually in Paul are really quite close. They are both about trusting God and living a life shaped by the death of Jesus. So this is part of a much larger conversation, of course, but I think if you start by saying, how do I get to heaven? Do I have to do good works or not? Wrong question, but if you ask that question, the answer is no. You simply believe and trust. God reaches out and you say thank you and believe. But if you start by saying... And Paul articulates that. But the works which Paul rules out, and which Cranmer is echoing there, as in Galatians 3, as in Romans 3, as in Galatians 2 as well, primarily for Paul, these are the works of the law which mark out the Jewish people from their non-Jewish neighbors: circumcision, Sabbath, the food laws, and going to the temple and so on. Paul says, don't have to do that anymore. That was a good but temporary dispensation.
In terms of today's culture, where some find their Christian faith to be less than respected, oftentimes marginalized, people feel that holding to the position of the Christian faith can sometimes be derided and mocked. What does the Apostle Paul tell us about holding to the faith in the midst of a demanding culture?
Wow, yeah. I think his main answer to that question would be that this is what he is trying to model. And sometimes he is modeling it at the heart of a vibrant, loving, happy community that he's helping steer. Often he is modeling it when he's in prison, when he is just saying, I'm going to be loyal to Jesus, quite literally, even if they kill me. And at the end of Philippians, it's that fourth chapter of Philippians is perhaps one of the places where, if that was all we'd read, he sounds really quite like some of the Stoic moralists. He says, I know how to be abased, I know how to abound, I can do all things in the one who gives me strength. And there he is, I think, actually upstaging the philosophers who were seeking to have a humanness they could be proud of. And it's not in himself, it's in the Messiah. And so in the power of the Spirit and in union with the Messiah, he says, I can do all things. Pantadynamai, extraordinary. And in that context, the same, just earlier in the same passage, the famous bit, rejoice in the Lord always, etc., which is set to music and wonderfully sung here and there. He says, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is lovely, whatever is good report, any virtue, think about these things. That's a mental discipline. You know, the world is bombarding us to think about all the opposite things, everything that's bad. My phone just updated itself without my asking it a few days ago, and it's produced a Google feed which is all sorts of things that I actually don't want to think about, and telling me all sorts of stupid things and rather unfortunate things. Why do I need that? I don't know how to get rid of it, actually. If anyone can tell me afterwards, you happily reprogram it for me. But you know, Paul is saying, make sure that you positively put into your mind the things that are noble and lovely, wherever they are. And that's not just in the confines of the Christian community. That's, you know, go to the art gallery, celebrate human creativity, look at the beauties of the world around you. And then he says, but whatever you've heard and received and seen in me, that's what you're to do. In other words, there's an embrace of the goodness of God wherever it is, and then there is an embrace of this way of life. And those somehow are both affirmations of the goodness of God in creation and redemption. I think that's really, Philippians 4 is his best answer to that question.
That's a beautiful description. A final question from me before we go on to some questions that have been submitted. You talked earlier about the fact that if you were in a fight, you'd probably want Paul on your side. If you're in a debate, you probably would. But at the same time, he'd probably irritate you and annoy you occasionally. If you were to distill the Apostle Paul's singular strength, would it be his tenacity, his intellect, his grasp and ability to process the culture, his knowledge of Jewish scripture? What is the singular strength that do you think this man possesses?
It would be all of the above, but I think I would go back ultimately to his prayer life. that he is
His prayer life.
That he's a man clearly who, when he talks about praying constantly, this is what he does. And when I find a passage like 1 Corinthians 8, where he's retooling the Jewish prayer, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, with Jesus in the middle of it. For us, there is one God, one Lord. And when he's, there are some Jews who pray that prayer like some Eastern Orthodox pray the Jesus prayer with the rhythm of their breathing. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I think it's quite possible that Paul prayed that and similar Jewish but now Jesus-shaped prayers as the deep well. That's what I was talking about when I talked about the plant in harsh winter. When he's faced with that horrible, horrible moment, his prayer doesn't stop, but it has to go down deeper and deeper and deeper. And all the things you mentioned, his intellect, his tenacity, his ferocity with people who were getting it wrong, whatever, I think they are all rooted in that. That's where his security is.
So it's his prayer life.
Well, I want all the rest as well, but I think that's right at the heart of it.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay, well, we have some far more intelligent questions now from the floor. And the first one that's asked, I'm afraid I don't have the names of anybody who's put these, but I will just put them to you. Why has the church concentrated more on the teachings of Paul than the teachings of Jesus?
Great question, because...
Is it true?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And the teachings of Jesus tend to be reduced to short snippets, which are then recontextualized into a different framework, because Jesus was announcing that this is what it looks like when God's kingdom is coming on earth as in heaven, and much of the Western church has forgotten that. This is a gross overstatement, because many haven't, but many have, and have imagined that the whole gospel is about how we leave earth and go to heaven, and then Jesus' teaching is reduced to fragments of how we know that and what happens en route. But when you actually understand the Gospels as the description of how Jesus launched the kingdom of God on earth as in heaven, then you'll not only read the Gospels differently, you'll read Paul differently as well. Paul is implementing what Jesus achieved. A friend of mine said that so many Western churches treat the Gospels like the chips and dips before you go, in the sort of anteroom, before you go through to the dining room to have the red meat of the Pauline Gospel. And there's something deeply wrong about that, and I think Paul himself would rebuke us for that.
Okay. What was the thorn in Paul's flesh?
I have no idea, nor do you. I think
That's why we've invited you here.
Well, sorry. Maybe the thorn in my flesh is that I don't know what the thorn in Paul's flesh was.
Quite.
But, I mean, there have been all sorts of ideas. It might be a particular temptation that kept coming back. It may be a recurring illness. Some people have suggested that it was his recurring nightmare of the fact that he had stood by and held people's coats while they were stoning Stephen, that he just couldn't shake that. There's no way of knowing. People have tried to do some fancy footwork with Galatians 4 and so on about tear out your eyes and give them to me, as though maybe he's got a problem with his eyes. That might be so. I just don't think we have enough information. This may be surprising. I sometimes get accused of over-exegeting things, but here I'm being quite cautious.
What does this book tell us that Paul and the faithfulness of God doesn't cover? Everything, obviously, because we want people to buy the book. But setting that aside, is this repetitious?
There are, of course, overlaps, but I was worried about that to begin with. And then when I got going, I thought I actually don't need to worry about this, because I'm talking about Paul the man. I'm trying to get inside his skin. I'm trying to use the same sort of evidence, of course, because that's the evidence we've got, but in order to ask different kinds of questions, particularly about biographical development. I mean, obvious example, I start the body of the book after quite a long introduction with the story of Phineas. Phineas in the book of Numbers, ancient tale of sex and violence. It was a good way to start the book. It's Phineas who does the redemptive violence and becomes the model of zeal right through to rabbinic Judaism. In 1 Maccabees, Phineas is one of the models of zeal along with Elijah. These are people who do violent things to stop Israel going to the bad and to stop the pagan nonsense happening. Paul is role modeling Phineas, and it's Phineas of whom Psalm 106 says, Phineas did that, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness to all generations. Now, every other passage he talks about Phineas, the Bible talks, it's about God establishing a covenant with him. That tells you what that phrase means. It was reckoned to him as righteousness. It's one of the key phrases for Paul. Romans 4, Galatians 3, Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. I think Paul had that phrase in his head from early on. I didn't explore this in Paul and the Faithfulness of God, but I make it front and center. This is a driving force. So that then when the great thing happens, Paul rereads his scriptures and lo and behold, there is a different way of doing covenantal zeal.
Yeah. Another question that's asked, how do we tell the difference between those parts of Paul's teaching which are timeless and those parts which are culturally specific? And I imagine somebody, for example, may be referring to head coverings and women and men and so on.
Yeah,
how do you distinguish between what Paul is asserting as something that modern, or at any period of Christian living, people should embrace, and those things which were so culturally specific we can dismiss them?
Yeah. It's a good question, but there's a level underneath the question, because people often used to say that some parts of the Bible are timelessly true and others are merely culturally conditioned. And to that I want to say all the Bible is culturally conditioned. All the New Testament is written in first century Greek. The doctrine of justification means what it means within the world of Second Temple Judaism, within the world of 4th Ezra, within the world of the Dead Sea Scrolls, etc. Until you've thought your way through that, you're not in a position to understand. So justification is true, but it's not timeless. The quest for timeless truths has an uncomfortably Platonic sound to it. God's truth is incarnate truth. I am not a timeless person, nor are you. What good would a timeless... I want a truth that'll come real in my life, and you get that from stuff that was coming real in the first century.
Even though Paul himself refers to God's word being truthful itself.
Yes.
He imputes...
yes, but true... I mean, but well, this is a philosophical discussion we perhaps shouldn't get into, but take an obvious example. 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 is about food offered to idols. This is not a problem that most modern Christians have. And actually, the Galatian problem, should you or shouldn't you get circumcised, is not... I've never ministered in a congregation where that's been an issue.
No.
And yet, there are some, if you were ministering to a mixed Jew and Gentile congregation, say in the Middle East, that might be an issue, and you might have to do some work on that. However, the question of how to live as a faithful monotheistic Christian in a polytheistic society where there's all sorts of stuff which goes with idolatry, and how to navigate that is a huge and important question in our society, even though it doesn't consist of people offering sacrifices at pagan altars where the meat that then gets sold on into the market down the road. So that's something which... There may be areas where that still goes on and where you have to navigate it, but for most of us, we can, I think, make the translation reasonably easily. For the women's head covering, it's interesting because the arguments Paul uses are harder to understand than the command itself. It seems to me clear that he wants women, when leading in worship, to look like women and not like fake men. He doesn't want, in other words, a kind of androgynous sense of who they are. You celebrate being female, and in that society you wear head covering. Now, I grew up in churches where most of the women still wore hats, which were not at all like the sort of head coverings Paul had in mind, didn't fulfill the same function, but be that as it may. Now that's more or less gone out of the window in most churches. So we are navigating it again, and part of our problem with that is that Western society at the moment has got very, very confused about what male and female actually mean and what roles mean, and do we stereotype or don't we? So that we're not in a position to look back at Paul and say we've got it right and you didn't. However, it's important to, I was going to use the word distill, which is a difficult word because that implies this sort of boiling off of timeless truths, which I'm a bit worried about. Yeah.
I don't want to get into difficulties, but what do you say to some writers, some theologians even, who would impute a form of appalling sexism to the Apostle Paul?
Yeah.
Who would say that here is a man who is paternalistic, macho, and dismissive of women?
I would tell them to go and read Romans 16. Of course, the trouble with Romans 16 is if you ever go to a lecture course on Romans, people get so excited about the first 8 chapters that they barely get to 9 to 11, let alone 12 to 16. But chapter 16 begins by saying, I commend to you Phoebe, who's a deacon at the church in Cenchreae. Paul is giving this lady Phoebe, who seems to be an independent businesswoman traveling. He doesn't say, I'm giving it to Phoebe's husband. He's giving it to Phoebe, for goodness sake. She's coming to Rome. And the high probability is that Paul was expecting Phoebe to be the one who would go around the different house churches in Rome, reading this letter out and quite possibly explaining it. Now, that's a hypothesis, you can't prove it, but that is one custom which seems likely in that world. That means that it's quite probable that the first person ever to do a Bible exposition of Romans was a woman who was a deacon in the church of Cenchreae. And if you read on through Romans 16, there's lots of other women, including Junia, who's an apostle and so on, who are in leadership roles in the church. Paul accepts this as the norm.
And yet you know that Paul also says that women should be subject to their husbands in his written epistles, in explicit terms.
In 1 Timothy 2, and of course there is a debate as to whether 1 Timothy is Pauline or not, but even supposing it is, 2 of the hardest verbs to translate in Paul are there, where he says, I do not allow a woman to authentine. Look up authentine in a Greek dictionary. It includes all sorts of meanings, including murder. Paul can't mean that. But what's going on? I think it's usurping authority. He's right. It's one hypothesis, this is only a hypothesis, but it's not a bad one, is that 1 Timothy is written to a church in Ephesus. What do we know about Ephesus? The main religion in Ephesus, great is Artemis of the Ephesians, is a female cult where you've got women only in authority. It's possible that some in Ephesus were thinking that if we've got a new sort of religious expression, we better have women running it. So if there's any men in leadership here, sorry, you'll have to make room. Now, I don't know that, I can't prove it. I've explored that and some other options. In other words, it's not as easy as the King James Version would make it sound, and it's been very interesting to me to see over the course of my lifetime the way in which some people have clung to 1 Timothy 2 as though that's clear as day and enables us to override 1 Corinthians 11, Romans 16, etc. I'd rather do it the other way.
You talked earlier about Paul being concerned about holiness and unity, and how combining those two is the challenge for every pastoral minister, male or female, everywhere in the world. Question is asked, what would Paul say about the multi-denominational and fractious nature of the modern expression of church?
I think he would hang his head and say, you need to go back to square one and start again. I mean,
really?
After I wrote Paul and the Faithfulness of God, I was on the road doing various lectures and so on. And again, people said, what's the big thing that Paul would say if he could see us today? And I said, not only that we are disunited, but that we don't care about it. Or if we do, we go to an ecumenical meeting once a month and kind of salve our consciences that we've shaken hands with our Christian brothers and sisters down the road. Well, that's better than not. I mean, 100 years ago, Anglican bishops were sending angry letters to any of their clergy who dared to preach in a Methodist church. And where are we now tonight? This would have been unthinkable. We've come a long way, and let's enjoy that. But there's a long way still to go. Now, I think the tragedy is this. In the 16th century, the reformers rightly insisted on worship and scripture in their own language. But once you say, okay, have it in your own language, then you get the Germans worshipping in German and the Dutch in Dutch and the French in French and the English in English. And then as theological divisions emerge, those churches embrace different ways, and then they say, oh, they're heretics down the road, whereas in fact they were just speaking a different language, and it may turn out there are theological differences. Now, I'm not saying theological differences aren't important. Believe me, they're hugely important. But if we remain disunited and don't even care, then the principalities and powers are still running the show. Ephesians 3, Paul says that through the church, the multiplex wisdom of God, it's a lovely phrase in Greek, polypoikilos sophia tou theou, the many-coloured, many-splendid wisdom of God might be made known to the principalities and powers. And this is the point. Caesar would have loved to have had an empire in which people of all sorts were happy in one big family. It never worked. He tried to impose it as a a Roman uniformity. Paul is saying the glorious multicolored variety of the church is supposed to be united, and when that happens, Caesar will know that God has called time on his oppressive empire.
What is the importance of Paul's citizenship, his Roman citizenship? You've talked earlier about Paul being saturated in the Jewish scriptures, but what about his citizenship? And how does that play out?
Yeah, Paul's Roman citizenship enables him to do things and get out of jail free at one point in a way which wouldn't have been possible without. And I think Paul kind of relishes that he is a Roman citizen, he's born into Roman citizenship. We're not sure why. Possibly his father or grandfather had served in the army and been given citizenship or something. But some scholars today have rather resented that because they want Paul to be so counter-imperial and so countercultural that he would never have had Romans. I think that mistakes the complexity of Paul's mind and life. I think he relishes the fact that when the time had fully come, God sent forth his son. So we've got splendid roads and he can get about. We've got a splendid postal system and he can do stuff with that. We've got magistrates to whom he can appeal, and he knows the law as well as they do. He can tell them when they're getting it wrong. And so Paul uses his citizenship. That's why when he goes on his second missionary journey, the person he chooses as his chief partner, Silas, or Silvanus, he's a Roman citizen as well, and so they are both in this very interesting position. So that, when he's beaten and thrown into jail in Philippi, and the next day the magistrates say, tell those men to get out of town, Paul can play his trump card. He says, excuse me, beaten without trial, imprisoned without charge, Roman citizens sounds like a public apology. And he gets it, because they've all heard about Cicero's speech in Verim and know perfectly well that actually they could be in deep trouble here. And so Paul has got them. Of course, one of the interesting things is, how could he prove it? Because if you claimed to be a citizen and couldn't prove it, you'd be in deep trouble if they thought you were telling a lie. Roman citizens had a thing called a diploma, which was like a passport, which they might keep on a string around their body or something like that. And I'm not sure how Paul would have managed with that if he's being stripped and beaten and so on, but that seems to be part of the deal. And so then later on in Jerusalem, he says to the centurion who's about to have him tortured, think this is illegal, don't you? And oh my goodness, yeah, we nearly got into severe trouble here. So I think he kind of and then of course the appeal to Caesar. That's a stroke of great chutzpah, and I think Paul knows it's heavily ironic, but back of that he knows that he's fulfilling Isaiah 52 verses 13, 14 and 15, that kings shall shut their mouths because of him. That here is the servant preaching the gospel of the servant, and he expects the nations of the world to be shocked, even if it means they kill him en route.
Well, that's a great moment for me to shut my mouth. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor N.T. Wright.
Thank you.